to us from the very uh, from very early on. And it is this hierarchical notion, this notion that there's a place that for everyone, and you should stay in your place. The great chain of being, and at the top, and it's based on very, very old Judeo-Christian notions of like God at the top, angels and seraphims and cherubims, and then man. Notice I say man and not man and woman, and then animals and plants. And there's two ways to look at that. You can say, oh, well, man was given dominion over the earth, which is one interpretation. Yeah, that's not been working out so well. How's that got, where's that gotten us? Or to look at it as in terms of responsibility and stewardship. If you look at it from the hierarchical perspective, like like the jungle, okay, this is your place and this is where you belong and this is what you should stick to, rather than saying, hey, those of us, those who are a little higher, we have an obligation to elevate, to recognize the moral status, the interdependence of everything. And yet it's so ingrained into our language. It's so ingrained that we've created this dichotomy of persons versus property. Either your person or your property. Well, there's humans that used to be considered property. I think that is changing, but it's one of those things where I think a moral arc of the universe has taken a sweet old time on this. So to me, one of the big, hairy, audacious questions is, how do we shift that paradigm? How do we change it from the conversation, from basically saying, hey, it's a jungle out there, to, you know what, we're in this together. Let's tend this garden together.
Yeah, I think it starts with each of us and the way we choose to not only see the world, but also the way we treat others and and what we ask of ourselves, because I do believe that if we treat young people with respect from the time they're very young and make it very clear that we we respect and want to hear their voice, their authentic voice, they will learn to appreciate their own voice. But we can talk about everything on a theoretical level. I think we have to just start with curiosity and accountability. Because when we meet each new situation with complete curiosity and intellectual and emotional openness, then everything shifts to a completely different kind of paradigm.
To that point, Rick, I don't know if you're trying to direct us somewhere else, but just to build on that, Carolyn, I think if we are curious about what we have right now, the pattern of the world is giving us really important information about this particular framing of the internal landscape, right? What we have right now is this, if we just look at our youth, they're sort of a canary in the coal mine, right? In the context of how are youth doing? How are we really, even though in many ways, we've evolved the way we raise children are not well if we look at the mental health information.
It's terrible.
And so if we're just curious and we take your open-minded, like what's happening, right? We have this pattern on the world, and what is that giving us? It's not giving us the happiness, and not just as youth. Today's Axios news article talked about the happiness well, I think it was yesterday's actually. I'm maybe a day behind in my mental model, but it was talking about what is the happiness index of people in at least the United States. It wasn't speaking about the global happiness index, which I think would be interesting to look at as well. And so, if we just get curious about it in a real way, and then, I think there has to be, stories and frameworks that help us bridge from where we are to where we want to go, and recognize that we're on a ladder, right? We could say, if you believe in some of the other folks like Pinker and others who've studied world over, long periods of time, they would say, well, we're in, we have it as better than ever. And so every era has its own challenges to keep climbing the ladder. And we've experimented pretty aggressively with capitalism. We've also, I would say, experimented, this is not going to be popular, with democracy, and this sort of constant churning of the wheels of democracy creates tribalism. And so if every couple of years we're putting people in competition with each other, and it's, again, a dog-eat-dog kind of jungle fight, and languages fight language, right? It's not about how do we lift up. I know I'm saying a lot of things, so I don't want to collapse many ideas, but to me, a core is really modeling, but also modeling at scale, getting stories into the world that actually show a different way. Who are the successful players in the world today? Mostly people who have very sharp elbows and who have sort of been, raised on an exploitive framework, right? You grow, and win. And, kind of like damn the torpedoes, right? That's the world that we're currently storying into the consciousness of both ourselves and our youth. And they're getting that in school, even this relentless pursuit of, getting, more than a perfect grade, right? You have to not just get a 4.0, you got to get a 4.5 to get into, it's sort of ridiculous.
But do you think the young people, Elizabeth, see the people that you just described as successful? I mean,
good question.
That's what we were raised with, that success means people who have big titles and a lot of money. But I'm really wondering if the young people who have who have fought for the climate, who are fighting for change, really see these people as paragons of success.
It's a great question. And what are they? I think the question is, what are they choosing to do? Like, as they're sort of, because it's sort of, I think about our youth, when there's no consequence, when there's no, sort of dealing with reality of paying a mortgage and putting food on the table, then we're all altruists, actually. And then what happens is then there's this sort of food fight, right, for resources and capacity. And that's true even in the, in the charitable sector, where they're competing for grants and dollars. And so we've sort of gamified the whole system, It's a great question.
And hopefully at least some percentage of our youth are being taught at a very young age that they may not be responsible for a mortgage, but if they want something, they have to earn it, because that should start at 5 years old, not at 16 or 17.
If I could just use a Zoom metaphor, how we zoom in and out. That's a great way of looking at things from the sort of, micro level all up to the meta level. And while I concur that, you need to do things at a local level, on the other hand, if the overall system is so toxic, it does make it much more difficult. And returning to the metaphor, I mean, Aristotle said, our metaphors are embedded in our everyday language. And if we don't understand how our metaphors influence our behavior, and if we're driven predominantly by war and sports metaphors, then there's little chance of a garden metaphor finding root anywhere. So unless you really, appreciate at a meta level why it's so difficult to do this, then unless you can zoom out and look at it from a macro level and a meta level, how do you design ethical systems that can actually create equity governance? Because without that, if you don't have a framework of fairness that you can agree on and negotiate and say this is how we're going to live fairly, then it goes back to the old metaphor, the metaphors that we're living by, which is basically driven by competition. And our problems are so overwhelming that competition isn't going to solve them. The only way we're going to solve them is if we can learn how to collaborate. We got to collaborate. And all this infighting between tribes is just dissipating huge amount of resources that could be channeled in a way that could make a difference. And unless we change those dynamics and understand those power dynamics, doing things at a local level, which is important, but you got to scale, as you were saying, Elizabeth, you got to scale that up. How are you going to scale up? And there's one last thing I'll just put into the hopper. I think it's more than critical skills. It's ethical skills. There's a whole slew of different skills, emotional skills, and our educational systems do diddly squat on it. And what we also need is literacy. I mean, media literacy skills, because our kids are being influenced by media that we don't fully understand. I mean, how many of you spent time on TikTok and imagine what it'd be like to live your life by TikTok, which so many youths are? So, there's a huge generational gap in, the whole issue of the digital world, and it's just going to accelerate. So
I think
the question.
Elizabeth, I really liked what Elizabeth said about storytelling. In Witty, we have really expanded storytelling. Years ago, I read a book called, I think it was Clicks and Mortars, that Schwab's decided to train their thousands of employees by storytelling, because they understood that people remember stories and learn through stories. And I think creating a framework of stories, that's why I want to tell the story about my family therapy, because I think stories telling is one of the most effective ways to break down cultural barriers, to grasp differences, and to reach a point of collaboration. Winifred, are you raising a hand? Is that what that symbol is?
She's clapping. She's clapping.
Oh, clapping. Okay.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with you, Caroline. I think my brother's work as a professional storyteller and filmmaker has really made me appreciate the power and impact of stories. So in communities that I build, I always share a story about myself in order to drive a message. So I have a formula whereby I tell a short story and then I share a lesson that relates to the story. And people remember the stories, but people feel it gives them a sense of belonging. It gives them a sense of, oh, if this is your story, then I'm okay because I too have my story. And before you know what, you are not just connecting cognitively, that means just on your head, your mind, but there's a heart connection, there's a transfer of energy. You are not connecting heart to heart with each other. So there is so much power in storytelling. And over the past few years, I have made it a point to incorporate stories when I'm training, when I'm providing leadership training. I'm done speaking. Thanks for listening.
That is such a great point, Winifred, because it is true that when we connect only intellectually, it doesn't have nearly the power of connecting on an emotional feeling level. And that is the difference between effective leadership and leadership that's not effective. That's a big point that you made. Thank you for that.
I think, just to add on to that, I think storytelling helps us recognize that we're part of a larger whole. It makes us feel connected with
Yeah.
one another. And yeah, I absolutely. And how do we create inspiring, uplifting stories?
If I can build in on that storytelling component, I recently watched Star Wars again with my kiddo, and I hadn't watched it in a long time, as you guys may recall. I mean, this came out at a different point in my life. And what's interesting is I saw the story through, sort of, there is an interesting, like all, some of these epics, they have this sort of moral thread through, right? Where, the guy that becomes Darth Vader was a good guy, but, was in love with this person and, became dark, right? And then he saved his son and he sort of threw over the Dark Lord. And, and there's this sort of interesting circle, though, of, kind of morality thread through the story. Unfortunately, it's also, kind of reflective. It sort of casts into the future and into outer space, into sort of this galactic system, or intergalactic system, I should say, universal system, this idea of war and fighting. And, when my kiddo was younger, he said, we just need more good senators. That was sort of the paraphrase of, a young kid. We just need more good senators. And yet, the way we've structured the world still has this dislocation. And I know, Rick, we've talked about it before, maybe once, is this notion that in our dharmic, our family systems, and then our, sort of intersocietal, systems, there's all these rules: don't kill, don't do all these, negative things. But the minute you get outside the tribe, you can kill, you can do espionage, you can, there are no, it's really, kind of in this other realm of what's accepted. So we have this just natural disconnect. And if we think about the future stories that we need, if I think about, kind of a dream for a future set of storytellers that can imagine not only where we are today, but show a bridge, show people crossing that bridge and successfully occupying this new land that has these new principles with ethics built in. Because it's not enough just to say, hey, wouldn't it be great over here, kind of in a heaven, not on earth kind of paradigm. Like, I don't feel we have really good bridges yet, and we don't have really good stories of people crossing. There are some sort of business examples, as we talked about before, like Patagonia putting their stuff in, stock, but it's still a tiny fraction of the broad world. And even then, it doesn't answer the question of how would you get people motivated to take all these horrible risks in the system today and, find the capital to then cross that Rubicon. He crossed that Rubicon after he was already successful in the capital structure. So, there has to be examples that feel possible, kind of in the possible category as opposed to impossible.
Well,
I think one way we start. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think to just sort of circle back to what we were discussing, a lot of it is about defining success, and it'd be great to get away, get away from this notion that success is only financial.
Yeah.
It's about having a good life. It is about living a good life. And I think that is certainly one of the stories that resonate with people. Anyway, I'm sorry, Carolyn, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say that I think stories that include the price people pay when they compromise their principles because they're in a business or whatever the context is, that somehow it's okay. So that's extremely important to me. But I grew up in a family business where I saw my parents always being honest about the choices they made. And I love that. I respected them for that. And I wanted that for myself. And so one of the things I wanted to do when I started Witty was to have a code of ethics. And one of the things I do in my personal life is I won't buy from companies who support political views that I feel are hurting our democracy. So I try to constantly check myself and make sure that everything I'm doing reflects my beliefs. And I feel that makes me healthier, happier, and also empowers me to make a bigger difference. And those are the stories we should be telling and sharing, because that's part of physical health and mental health. It's all connected.
You know, if I could just chime in, as I've been listening, I've been reflecting about what would be our next question for our next month's session. I was speaking with David about this, how to set up more in advance. And I think storytelling is incredibly important. And actually, we started this off with storytelling. And I wrote a blog post, which I've shared there, about my own personal story, about my own interest in equity and why it's so important from my lived experience and the influence of my mother. But that's very much at a sort of, you know, family level. And the question I came up with, and I'll put it in here, and this might be something as a launching pad, because our own personal stories are incredibly important. On aggregate, they are. But actually, we also need I'm going to pose this question, which is how can we create an ecological, it says framework of equity story movements or something like that. I'll tweak it, but the idea is there. Because we also need stories, what I would call equity moonshot stories, where people are actually going to scale on this stuff. And there are examples of this, but we don't highlight it. I mean, Earthshot, for example, has lots of stories like that, but it's not addressing equity. And so saving the Earth when humanity is, you know, in a state of decline is, you know, they got to be done together. And that comes back to the reductionist perspective of just looking at the Earth in isolation. We have to think of it ecologically. And so let me tweak that question. So my question to the listeners, is there interest in tweaking this question for the next time so that we can actually get down to a little bit more doing and how to do this stuff? Because I have more ideas than I can explain now. But maybe that could be the question or a variation on that. How to create an ecological framework of equity stories or an ecological, I'll play around with, but you get the gist of what I'm saying. I haven't clarified the question in my head yet even, but I'd like to propose that as maybe the next session. What are people's reactions to that?
Rick, there's something, these are such great conversations that we're having. I like that you are thinking about a holistic perspective in terms of that. I wonder, how we incorporate a holistic framework into that question. That's kind of because you're talking about equity, and I think anyway, that equity, we're talking about equity for humanity, but we're part of this larger system.
Of course.
So, so how do we
well, equity to me is part of the human system. Nature was never designed for equity or inequities. So the biomimicry metaphors don't apply. On the other hand, I would say that we've done a remarkably good job of designing an incredibly inequitable system. It's amazingly inequitable. It is stellar. And the question is, do we want to keep on following that star? And we are. Whether we even if we don't think we are, we're following it. So the question is, how do we create a constellation of different virtues that we can move towards? Because that's why you need an ecological framework. You need people telling stories at meta, macro, meso, nano levels. All of them need to be sort of pulled together. That's the reason why I'm thinking about it. Let me just play around with it anyway.
And to that, I just want to comment. We have a lot to learn from nature. You know, for example, the mycelium and you know, how it's cooperative and its communications. So Yeah,
Oh,
thanks.
I agree with you. There's huge amounts, but human systems are more complex than nature. And so, yes, borrow from the best and replicate, but nature isn't going to deal with our techno-liberal technocracy of social
No,
media.
but I think we can learn lessons from it. We could.
Oh, yes.
we
Yeah.
could-
But definitely. Definitely. No, I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying we have to go and above beyond the biomimicry framework. I mean, I've had these discussions before with people who have they zoom in on regeneration and, nature and whatever, but they don't expand out. So this is the reason why the notion of zooming and changing perspectives is so critically important to be able to hopefully create a movement, an equity movement around this. So anyway, I think we're coming up close to the hour. So any closing comments? But let me muse over this question. I'll send it out to you, and then we'll see whether there's energy to follow that question.
Just wanted to say thank you for another stimulating conversation. This has been excellent. And I like the directionality, Rick, of the question. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And so I look forward to next time and being on time.
Well, let's see if we can next time. Let's see if we can create a mycelium network by inviting more people in. I do appreciate the Linda the biomimicry metaphors. I also use the word tapestries as well. How do we create tapestries? But we need different metaphors to live by. No question about it.
Is this going to be posted on LinkedIn, on YouTube, anything like that? On your blog?
I was going to put it up on the blog there actually, so that if you want to come back to it, you can revisit things and say, well, what I mean? So it actually creates, the metaphor I like to use is we should stop using full stops and have commas. And what I mean by that, once you initiate, a month later, you won't remember very much about this. On the other hand, if you go back and you look at it or something triggers, then you can reconnect with it. And that's what I mean by, an equity movement has to create an ongoing threads of stories that hopefully we can weave in a way that bends the arc. There you go, mixed metaphors.
I think the next session would be great if we just shared stories. I think we should start with some serious storytelling.
Love that.
You're muted, Rick. And we are looking for topics through the end of the year too. So I think, throw out what you have.
Well, what I was going to suggest is this question emerged out of this conversation. So maybe we should let it emerge after the next conversation rather than setting out an agenda. Because once you set an agenda, you've already predetermined what you're going to talk about, and it may not be where the energy needs to go. So let's be emergent. So that's completely different to what we talked about earlier today. But based upon this experience, I think we should be emergent.
And I just might add a and to that, which is perhaps have a parking lot so that sort of ideas and sort of questions can be banked, and then it may make sense to pull elements out depending on how that daisy chain of thoughts work.
Well, I love the metaphor, but if you have any ideas, go to the blog post, add it there. Any comments from today, add it so you can remember what thoughts you had afterwards. Because if you don't write them down, in a month, they're gone.
I know. Now I have to just get it transferred from my pages to there.
Right.
It was
to me, this is getting into the spirit of what I call generative dialogue, and we were just gaining momentum towards the end. And that's, to me, is where the creativity comes into play. So as we develop our skills, hopefully we can accelerate that process so that we can disseminate it through the mycelium network. Okay.
It's such a pleasure to be part of this and to see you all and speak with you all. I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. It was fun. I think David had to go, so we're in.